Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of My Disillusionment in Russia by Emma Goldman. Chapter 25, originally published as Chapter 4 of My Further Disillusionment in Russia. Archangel and Return.
On November 28th, the expedition again got underway, this time with 3 members only, Alexander Berkman, the secretary, and myself. We traveled by way of Moscow to Archangel, with stops in Vologda and Yaroslavl. Vologda had been the seat of various foreign embassies, unofficially engaged in aiding the enemies of the revolution. We expected to find historic material there, but we were informed that most of it had been destroyed or otherwise wasted. The Soviet institutions were uninteresting. It was a plodding, sleepy provincial town. In Yaroslavl, where the so-called Savinkov uprising had taken place 2 years previously, no significant data were found. We continued to Archangel. The stories we had heard of the frozen north made us rather apprehensive, but, much to our relief, we found that city no colder than Petrograd and much drier. The chairman of the Archangel Ispolkom was a pleasant type of communist, not at all officious or stern. As soon as we had stated our mission, he set the telephone going. Every time he reached some official on the wire, he would address him as Dear Tovarishch, and inform him that Dear Tovarishchi from the center had arrived and must be given every assistance. He thought that our stay would be profitable because many important documents had remained after the Allies had withdrawn. There were files of old newspapers published by the Tchaikovsky government and photographs of the brutalities perpetrated upon the communists by the whites. The chairman himself had lost his whole family, including his 12-year-old sister. As he had to leave the next day to attend the Conference of Soviets in Moscow, he promised to issue an order giving us access to the archives. Leaving the Ispolkom to begin our rounds, we were surprised by 3 sleighs waiting for us, thanks to the thoughtfulness of the chairman. Tucked up under fur covers and with bells tinkling, each member of the expedition started in a different direction to cover the departments assigned to him. The Archangel Soviet officials appeared to have great respect for the center. The word acted like magic, opening every door. The head of the Department of Education was a hospitable and kindly man. After explaining to me in detail the work done in his institution, he called to his office a number of employees, informed them of the purpose of the expedition, and asked them to prepare the material they could gather for the museum. Among those Soviet workers was a nun, a pleasant-faced young woman. What a strange thing, I thought, to find a nun in a Soviet office. The chairman noticed my surprise. He had quite a number of nuns in his department, he said. When the monasteries had been nationalized, the poor women had no place to go. He conceived the idea of giving them a chance to do useful work in the new world. He had found no cause to regret his action. He did not convert the nuns to communism, but they became very faithful and industrious workers, and the younger ones had even expanded a little. He invited me to visit the little art studio where several nuns were employed. The studio was a rather unusual place, not so much because of its artistic value as on account of the people who worked there, 2 old nuns who had spent 40 and 25 years, respectively, in monasteries, a young white officer and an elderly workingman. The last 2 had been arrested as counter-revolutionists and were condemned to death, but the chairman rescued them in order to put them to useful work. He wanted to give an opportunity to those who through ignorance or accident were the enemies of the revolution. A revolutionary period, he remarked, necessitated stern measures, even violence, but other methods should be tried first. He had many in his department who had been considered counter-revolutionary, but now they were all doing good work. It was the most extraordinary thing I had heard from a communist. "Aren't you considered a sentimental bourgeois?" I asked. "Yes, indeed," he replied smilingly, "but that is nothing. The main thing is that I have been able to prove that my sentimentalism works, as you can see for yourself." The carpenter was the artist of the studio. He had never been taught, but he did beautiful carving and was a master in every kind of woodwork. The nuns made color drawings of flowers and vegetables, which were used for demonstration by lecturers in the villages. They also painted posters, mainly for the children's festivals. I visited the studio several times alone so that I might speak freely to the carpenter and the nuns. They had little understanding of the elemental facts that had pulled them out of their moorings. The carpenter lamented that times were hard because he was not permitted to sell his handiwork. "I used to earn a good bit of money, but now I hardly get enough to eat," he would say. The sisters did not complain. They accepted their fate as the will of God. Yet there was a change even in them. Instead of being shut away in a nunnery, they were brought in touch with real life, and they had become more human. Their expression was less forbidding. Their work showed signs of kinship with the world around them. I noticed it particularly in their drawings of children and children's games. There was a tenderness about them that spoke of the long-suppressed mother instinct struggling for expression. The former white officer was the most intelligent of the four. He had gone through life's crucible. He had learned the folly and crime of intervention, he said, and would never lend his aid to it again. What had convinced him? The interventionists themselves. They had been in Archangel, and they carried on as if they owned the city. The Allies had promised much, but they had done nothing except enrich a few persons who speculated in the supplies intended to benefit the population. Everyone gradually turned against the interventionists. I wondered how many of the countless ones shot as counter-revolutionists would have been won over to the new regime and would now be doing useful work if somebody had saved their lives. I had seen so many show schools that I decided to say nothing about visiting educational institutions until some unexpected moment when one could take them by surprise. For our first Saturday in Archangel, a special performance of Leonid Andreev's play Sava had been arranged. For a provincial theater, considering also the lack of preparation, the drama was fairly well done. After the performance, I told the chairman of the Department X that I would like to visit his schools early next morning. Without hesitation, he consented and even offered to call for the other members of the expedition. We visited several schools, and in point of cleanliness, comfort, and general cheerfulness, I found them a revelation. It was also beautiful to see the fond relationship that existed between the children and X. Their joy was spontaneous and frank at the sight of him. The moment he appeared, they would throw themselves upon him, shouting with delight. They climbed on him and clung to his neck. And he, never once did I see such a picture in any school in Petrograd or Moscow. He threw himself on the floor, the children about him, and played and frolicked with them as if they were his own. He was one of them. They knew it, and they felt at home with him. Similar beautiful relationships I found in every school and children's home we visited. The children were radiant when X appeared. They were the first happy children I had seen in Russia. It strengthened my conviction of the significance of personality and the importance of mutual confidence and love between teacher and pupil. We visited a number of schools that day. Nowhere did I find any discrimination. Everywhere the children had spacious dormitories, spotlessly clean rooms and beds, good food and clothes. The atmosphere of the schools was warm and intimate. We found in Archangel many historic documents, including the correspondence between Tchaikovsky of the Provisional Government and General Miller, the representative of the Allies. It was pathetic to read the pleading, almost cringing words of the old pioneer of the revolutionary movement in Russia, the founder of the Tchaikovsky circles, the man I had known for years, by whom I had been inspired. The letters exposed the weakness of the Tchaikovsky regime and the arbitrary rule of the Allied troops. Particularly significant was the farewell message of a sailor about to be executed by the whites. He described his arrest and cross-examination and the fiendish third degree applied by an English army officer at the point of a gun. Among the material collected by us were also copies of various revolutionary and anarchist publications issued sub rosa. From the Department of Education we received many interesting posters and drawings, as well as pamphlets and books, and a collection of specimens of the children's work. Among them was a velvet table cover painted by the nuns and portraying Archangel children in gay colors, presented as their greeting to the children of America. The schools and the splendid man at their head were not the only noteworthy features of Archangel. The other Soviet institutions also proved efficient. There was no sabotage, the various bureaus worked in good order, and the general spirit was sincere and progressive. The food distribution was especially well organized. Unlike most other places, there was no loss of time or waste of energy connected with procuring one's rations. Yet Archangel was not particularly well supplied with provisions. One could not help thinking of the great contrast in this regard between that city and Moscow. Archangel probably learned a lesson in organization from contact with Americans, the last thing the Allies intended. The Archangel visit was so interesting and profitable that the expedition delayed its departure, and we remained much longer than originally planned. Before leaving, I called on X. If anything could be sent him from the center, what would he like most? I asked. Paints and canvas for our little studio, he replied. See Lunacharsky and get him to send us some. Splendid, gracious personality. We left Archangel for Murmansk, but we had not gone far when we were overtaken by a heavy snowstorm. We were informed that we could not reach Murmansk in less than a fortnight, a journey which, under normal conditions, required 3 days. There was also danger of not being able to return to Petrograd on time, the snow often blocking the roads for weeks. We therefore decided to turn back to Petrograd. When we came within 75 versts, about 50 miles, of that city, we ran into a blizzard. It would take days before the track would be cleared sufficiently to enable us to proceed. Not cheerful news, but fortunately, we were supplied with fuel and enough provisions for some time. It was the end of December, and we celebrated Christmas Eve in our car. The night was glorious, the sky brilliant with stars, the earth clad in white. A small pine tree, artfully decorated by the secretary and enthroned in our diner, graced the occasion. The glow of the little wax candles lent a touch of romance to the scene. Gifts for our fellow travelers came all the way from America. They had been given us by friends in December 1919, when we were on Ellis Island awaiting deportation. A year had passed since then, an excruciating year. Arriving in Petrograd, we found the city agitated by the heated discussion of the role of the trade unions. Conditions in the latter had resulted in so much discontent among the rank and file that the Communist Party was at last forced to take up the issue. Already in October, the trade union question had been brought up at the sessions of the Communist Party. The discussions continued all through November and December, reaching their climax at the 8th All-Russian Congress of the Soviets. All the leading communists participated in the great verbal contest, which was to decide the fate of the labor organizations. The thesis discussed disclosed 4 different views. First, that of the Lenin-Zinoviev faction, which held that the main function of the trade unions under the proletarian dictatorship is to serve as schools of communism. Second, the group represented by the old communist Ryasanov, which insisted that the trade unions must function as the forum of the workers and their economic protector. Trotsky led the third faction. He believed that the trade unions would in the course of time become the managers and controllers of the industries, but for the present the unions must be subject to strict military discipline and be made entirely subservient to the needs of the state. The fourth and most important tendency was that of the labor opposition, headed by Madame Kollontai and Shliapnikov, who expressed the sentiment of the workers themselves and had their support. This opposition argued that the governmental attitude toward the trade unions had destroyed the interest of the toilers in the economic reconstruction of the country and paralyzed their productive capacity. They emphasized that the October Revolution had been fought to put the proletariat in control of the industrial life of the country. They demanded the liberation of the masses from the yoke of the bureaucratic state and its corrupt officialdom, an opportunity for the exercise of the creative energies of the workers. The labor opposition voiced the discontent and aspirations of the rank and file. It was a battle royal, with Trotsky and Zinoviev chasing each other over the country in separate special trains to disprove each other's contentions. In Petrograd, for instance, Zinoviev's influence was so powerful that it required a big struggle before Trotsky received permission to address the communist local on his views in the controversy. The latter engendered intense feeling and for a time threatened to disrupt the party. At the Congress, Lenin denounced the labor opposition as anarcho-syndicalist middle-class ideology and advocated its entire suppression. Shliapnikov, one of the most influential leaders of the opposition, was referred to by Lenin as a peeved commissar, and was subsequently silenced by being made a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Madame Kollontai was told to hold her tongue or get out of the party. Her pamphlet setting forth the views of the opposition was suppressed. Some of the lesser lights of the labor opposition were given a vacation in the Cheka, and even Ryasanov, an old and tried communist, was suppressed for 6 months from all union activities. Soon after our arrival in Petrograd, we were informed by the secretary of the museum that a new institution known as the Ispart had been formed in Moscow to collect material about the history of the Communist Party. This organization also proposed to supervise all future expeditions of the Museum of the Revolution and to place them under the direction of a political commissar. It became necessary to go to Moscow to ascertain the facts in the case. We had seen too many evils resulting from the dictatorship of the political commissar, the ever-present espionage and curtailment of independent effort. We could not consent to the change which was about to be made in the character of our expedition.
Chapter 26, originally published as Chapter 5 of My Further Disillusionment in Russia. Death and Funeral of Peter Kropotkin.
When I reached Moscow in January 1921, I learned that Peter Kropotkin had been stricken with pneumonia. I immediately offered to nurse him, but as one nurse was already in attendance and the Kropotkin cottage was too small to accommodate extra visitors, it was agreed that Sasha Kropotkin, who was then in Moscow, should go to Dimitrov to find out whether I was needed. I had previously arranged to leave for Petrograd the next day. Till the moment of departure, I waited for a call from the village. None coming, I concluded that Kropotkin was improving. 2 days later, in Petrograd, I was informed by Ravich that Kropotkin had grown worse and that I was asked to come to Moscow at once. I left immediately, but unfortunately my train was 10 hours overdue, so that I reached Moscow too late to connect with Dimitrov. There were at the time no morning trains to the village, and it was not till the eve of February 7th that I was at last seated in a train bound for the place. Then the engine went off for fuel and did not return until 1 a.m. of the next day. When I finally arrived at the Kropotkin cottage on February 8th, I learned the terrible news that Peter had died about an hour before. He had repeatedly called for me, but I was not there to render the last service to my beloved teacher and comrade, one of the world's greatest and noblest spirits. It had not been given to me to be near him in his last hours. I would at least remain until he was carried to his final resting place. 2 things had particularly impressed me on my 2 previous visits to Kropotkin: his lack of bitterness toward the Bolsheviki and the fact that he never once alluded to his own hardships and privations. It was only now, while the family was preparing for the funeral, that I learned some details of his life under the Bolshevik regime. In the early part of 1918, Kropotkin had grouped around him some of the ablest specialists in political economy. His purpose was to make a careful study of the resources of Russia, to compile these in monographs, and to turn them to practical account in the industrial reconstruction of the country. Kropotkin was the editor-in-chief of the undertaking. 1 volume was prepared, but never published. The Federalist League, as this scientific group was known, was dissolved by the government and all the material confiscated. On 2 occasions were the Kropotkin apartments in Moscow requisitioned, and the family forced to seek other quarters. It was after these experiences that the Kropotkins moved to Dimitrov, where old Peter became an involuntary exile. Kropotkin, in whose home in the past had gathered from every land all that was best in thought and ideas, was now forced to lead the life of a recluse. His only visitors were peasants and workers of the village and some members of the intelligentsia, whose wont it was to come to him with their troubles and misfortunes. He had always kept in touch with the world through numerous publications, but in Dimitrov he had no access to these sources. His only channels of information now were the 2 government papers, Pravda and Izvestia. He was also greatly handicapped in his work on the new ethics while he lived in the village. He was mentally starved, which to him was greater torture than physical malnutrition. It is true that he was given a better pake than the average person, but even that was insufficient to sustain his waning strength. Fortunately, he occasionally received from various sources assistance in the form of provisions. His comrades from abroad, as well as the anarchists of the Ukraine, often sent him food packages. Once he received some gifts from Makhno, at that time heralded by the Bolsheviki as the terror of counter-revolution in southern Russia. Especially did the Kropotkins feel the lack of light. When I visited them in 1920, they were considering themselves fortunate to be able to have even one room lit. Most of the time, Kropotkin worked by the flicker of a tiny oil lamp that nearly drove him blind. During the short hours of the day, he would transcribe his notes on a typewriter, slowly and painfully pounding out every letter. However, it was not his own discomfort which sapped his strength. It was the thought of the revolution that had failed, the hardships of Russia, the persecutions, the endless razdrals, which made the last 2 years of his life a deep tragedy. On 2 occasions, he attempted to bring the rulers of Russia to their senses, once in protest against the suppression of all non-communist publications, the other time against the barbaric practice of taking hostages. Ever since the Cheka had begun its activities, the Bolshevik government had sanctioned the taking of hostages. Old and young, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, even children, were kept as hostages for the alleged offense of one of their kin, of which they often knew nothing. Kropotkin regarded such methods as inexcusable under any circumstances. In the fall of 1920, members of the Social Revolutionist Party that had succeeded in getting abroad threatened retaliation if communist persecution of their comrades continued. The Bolshevik government announced in its official press that for every communist victim, it would execute 10 social revolutionists. It was then that the famous revolutionist Vera Figner and Peter Kropotkin sent their protest to the powers that be in Russia. They pointed out that such practices were the worst blot on the Russian Revolution and an evil that had already brought terrible results in its wake. History would never forgive such methods. The other protest was made in reply to the plan of the government to liquidate all private publishing establishments, including even those of the cooperatives. The protest was addressed to the Presidium of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, then in session. It is interesting to note that Gorky himself, an official of the Commissariat of Education, had sent a similar protest. In this statement, Kropotkin called attention to the danger of such a policy to all progress, in fact, to all thought, and emphasized that such state monopoly would make creative work utterly impossible. But the protests had no effect. Thereafter, Kropotkin felt that it was useless to appeal to a government gone mad with power. During the 2 days I spent in the Kropotkin household, I learned more of his personal life than during all the years that I had known him. Even his closest friends were not aware that Peter Kropotkin was an artist and a musician of much talent. Among his effects, I discovered a collection of drawings of great merit. He loved music passionately, and was himself a musician of unusual ability. Much of his leisure he spent at the piano. And now he lay on his couch in the little workroom, as if peacefully asleep, his face as kindly in death as it had been in life. Thousands of people made pilgrimages to the Kropotkin cottage to pay homage to this great son of Russia. When his remains were carried to the station to be taken to Moscow, the whole population of the village attended the impressive funeral procession to express their last affectionate greeting to the man who had lived among them as their friend and comrade. The friends and comrades of Kropotkin decided that the anarchist organizations should have exclusive charge of the funeral, and a Peter Kropotkin funeral commission was formed in Moscow, consisting of representatives of the various anarchist groups. The committee wired Lenin, asking him to order the release of all anarchists imprisoned in the capital in order to give them the opportunity to participate in the funeral. Owing to the nationalization of all public conveyances, printing establishments, etc., the Anarchist Funeral Commission was compelled to ask the Moscow Soviet to enable it to carry out successfully the funeral program. The anarchists being deprived of their own press, the commission had to apply to the authorities for the publication of the matter necessary in connection with the funeral arrangements. After considerable discussion, permission was secured to print 2 leaflets and to issue a 4-page bulletin in commemoration of Peter Kropotkin. The commission requested that the paper be issued without censorship and stated that the reading matter would consist of appreciations of our dead comrade exclusive of all polemical questions. This request was categorically refused. Having no choice, the commission was forced to submit, and the manuscripts were sent in for censorship, to forestall the possibility of remaining without any memorial issue because of the delaying tactics of the government. The Funeral Commission resolved to open, on its own responsibility, a certain anarchist printing office that had been sealed by the government. The bulletin and the 2 leaflets were printed in that establishment. In answer to the wire sent to Lenin, the Central Committee of the All-Russian Executive of the Soviets resolved to propose to the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission, Vecheka, to release, according to its judgment, the imprisoned anarchists for participation in the funeral of Peter A. Kropotkin. The delegates sent to the Cheka were asked whether the funeral commission would guarantee the return of the prisoners. They replied that the question had not been discussed. The Cheka thereupon refused to release the anarchists. The funeral commission, informed of the new development in the situation, immediately guaranteed the return of the prisoners after the funeral. Thereupon the Cheka replied that there are no anarchists in prison who, in the judgment of the chairman of the Extraordinary Commission, could be released for the funeral. The remains of the dead lay in state in the Hall of Columns in the Moscow Labor Temple. On the morning of the funeral, the Kropotkin Funeral Commission decided to inform the assembled people of the breach of faith on the part of the authorities and demonstratively to withdraw from the temple all the wreaths presented by official communist bodies. Fearing public exposure, the representatives of the Moscow Soviet definitely promised that all the anarchists imprisoned in Moscow would immediately be released to attend the funeral. But this promise was also broken, only 7 of the anarchists being released from the inner jail of the Extraordinary Commission. None of the anarchists imprisoned in the Butyrki attended the funeral. The official explanation was that the 20 anarchists incarcerated in that prison refused to accept the offer of the authorities. Later, I visited the prisoners to ascertain the facts in the case. They informed me that a representative of the Extraordinary Commission insisted on individual attendance, making exceptions in some cases. The anarchists, aware that the promise of temporary release was collective, demanded that the stipulations be kept. The Cheka representative went to the telephone to consult the higher authorities, so he said. He did not return. The funeral was a most impressive sight. It was a unique demonstration never witnessed in any other country. Long lines of members of anarchist organizations, labor unions, scientific and literary societies, and student bodies marched for over 2 hours from the labor temple to the burial place, 7 versts, nearly 5 miles distant. The procession was headed by students and children carrying wreaths presented by various organizations. Anarchist banners of black and scarlet socialist emblems floated above the multitude. The mile-long procession entirely dispensed with the services of the official guardians of the peace. Perfect order was kept by the multitude itself, spontaneously forming in several rows, while students and workers organized a live chain on both sides of the marchers. Passing the Tolstoy Museum, the cortege paused and the banners were lowered in honor of the memory of another great son of Russia. A group of Tolstoyans on the steps of the museum rendered Chopin's funeral march as an expression of their love and reverence for Kropotkin. The brilliant winter sun was sinking behind the horizon when the remains of Kropotkin were lowered into the grave, after speakers of many political tendencies had paid the last tribute to their great teacher and comrade.
Chapter 27, originally published as Chapter 6 of My Further Disillusionment in Russia. Kronstadt.
In February 1921, the workers of several Petrograd factories went on strike. The winter was an exceptionally hard one, and the people of the capital suffered intensely from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. They asked an increase of their food rations, some fuel, and clothing. The complaints of the strikers, ignored by the authorities, presently assumed a political character. Here and there was also voiced a demand for the Constituent Assembly and free trade. The attempted street demonstration of the strikers was suppressed, the government having ordered out the military kursanti. Lisa Zorin, who of all the communists I had met remained closest to the people, was present at the breaking up of the demonstration. One woman became so enraged over the brutality of the military that she attacked Lisa. The latter, true to her proletarian instincts, saved the woman from arrest and accompanied her home. There she found the most appalling conditions. In a dark and damp room there lived a worker's family with its 6 children, half naked in the bitter cold. Subsequently, Lisa said to me, "I felt sick to think that I was in the Astoria." Later, she moved out. When the Kronstadt sailors learned what was happening in Petrograd, they expressed their solidarity with the strikers in their economic and revolutionary demands, but refused to support any call for the Constituent Assembly. On March 1st, the sailors organized a mass meeting in Kronstadt, which was attended also by the chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee, Kalinin, the presiding officer of the Republic of Russia, the commander of the Kronstadt fortress, Kuzmin, and the chairman of the Kronstadt Soviet, Vasiliev. The meeting, held with the knowledge of the Executive Committee of the Kronstadt Soviet, passed a resolution approved by the sailors, the garrison, and the citizens' meeting of 16,000 persons. Kalinin, Kuzmin, and Vasiliev spoke against the resolution, which later became the basis of the conflict between Kronstadt and the government. It voiced the popular demand for Soviets elected by the free choice of the people. It is worth reproducing that document in full, that the reader may be enabled to judge the true character of the Kronstadt demands. The resolution read, "Having heard the report of the representatives sent by the General Meeting of Ship Crews to Petrograd to investigate the situation there, resolved, 1. In view of the fact that the present Soviets do not express the will of the workers and the peasants, immediately to hold new elections by secret ballot, the pre-election campaign to have full freedom of agitation among the workers and peasants. 2. To establish freedom of speech and press for workers and peasants, for anarchists and left socialist parties. 3. To secure freedom of assembly for labor unions and peasant organizations. 4. To call a nonpartisan conference of the workers, Red Army soldiers and sailors of Petrograd, Kronstadt, and of Petrograd Province, no later than March 10, 1921. 5. To liberate all political prisoners of socialist parties, as well as all workers, peasants, soldiers, and sailors imprisoned in connection with the labor and peasant movements. 6. To elect a commission to review the cases of those held in prisons and concentration camps. 7. To abolish all politotally political bureaus, because no party should be given special privileges in the propagation of its ideas or receive the financial support of the government for such purposes. Instead, there should be established educational and cultural commissions, locally elected and financed by the government. 8. To abolish immediately all Zagryaditelnia Otriadi, armed units organized by the Bolsheviki for the purpose of suppressing traffic and confiscating foodstuffs. 9. To equalize the rations of all who work, with the exception of those employed in trades detrimental to health. 10. To abolish the communist fighting detachments in all branches of the army, as well as the communist guards kept on duty in mills and factories. Should such guards or military detachments be found necessary, they are to be appointed in the army from the ranks, and in the factories according to the judgment of the workers. 11. To give the peasants full freedom of action in regard to their land, and also the right to keep cattle, on condition that the peasants manage with their own means, that is, without employing hired labor. 12. To request all branches of the army as well as our comrades the military cursanti to concur in our resolutions. 13. To demand that the press give the fullest publicity to our resolutions. 14. To appoint a traveling commission of control. 15. To permit free kustarnoi, individual small-scale production by one's own efforts. On March 4th, the Petrograd Soviet was to meet, and it was generally felt that the fate of Kronstadt would be decided then. Trotsky was to address the gathering, and as I had not yet had an opportunity to hear him in Russia, I was anxious to attend. My attitude in the matter of Kronstadt was still undecided. I could not believe that the Bolsheviki would deliberately fabricate the story about General Kozlovsky as the leader of the sailors. The Soviet meeting, I expected, would clarify the matter. Tauride Palace was crowded, and a special body of cursanti surrounded the platform. The atmosphere was very tense. All waited for Trotsky. But when at 10 o'clock he had not arrived, Zinoviev opened the meeting. Before he had spoken 15 minutes, I was convinced that he himself did not believe in the story of Kozlovsky. "Of course, Kozlovsky is old and can do nothing," he said, "but the white officers are back of him and are misleading the sailors." Yet for days the Soviet papers had heralded General Kozlovsky as the moving spirit in the uprising. Kalinin, whom the sailors had permitted to leave Kronstadt unmolested, raved like a fishmonger. He denounced the sailors as counter-revolutionists and called for their immediate subjugation. Several other communists followed suit. When the meeting was opened for discussion, a working man from the Petrograd arsenal demanded to be heard. He spoke with deep emotion, and ignoring the constant interruptions, he fearlessly declared that the workers had been driven to strike because of the government's indifference to their complaints. The Kronstadt sailors, far from being counter-revolutionists, were devoted to the revolution. Facing Zinoviev, he reminded him that the Bolshevik authorities were now acting toward the workers and sailors just as the Kerensky government had acted toward the Bolsheviki. "Then you were denounced as counter-revolutionists and German agents," he said. "We, the workers and sailors, protected you and helped you to power. Now you denounce us and are ready to attack us with arms. Remember, you are playing with fire." Then a sailor spoke. He referred to the glorious revolutionary past of Kronstadt, appealed to the communists not to engage in fratricide, and read the Kronstadt resolution to prove the peaceful attitude of the sailors. But the voice of these sons of the people fell on deaf ears. The Petro-Soviet, its passions roused by Bolshevik demagoguery, passed the Zinoviev resolution ordering Kronstadt to surrender on pain of extermination. The Kronstadt sailors were ever the first to serve the revolution. They had played an important part in the revolution of 1905. They were in the front ranks in 1917. Under Kerensky's regime, they proclaimed the Commune of Kronstadt and opposed the Constituent Assembly. They were the advance guard in the October Revolution. In the great struggle against Yudenich, the sailors offered the strongest defense of Petrograd, and Trotsky praised them as the pride and glory of the revolution. Now, however, they had dared to raise their voice in protest against the new rulers of Russia. That was high treason from the Bolshevik viewpoint. The Kronstadt sailors were doomed. Petrograd was aroused over the decision of the Soviet. Some of the communists even, especially those of the French section, were filled with indignation. But none of them had the courage to protest, even in the party circles, against the proposed slaughter. As soon as the Petro-Soviet resolution became known, a group of well-known literary men of Petrograd gathered to confer as to whether something could not be done to prevent the planned crime. Someone suggested that Gorky be approached to head a committee of protest to the Soviet authorities. It was hoped that he would emulate the example of his illustrious countryman Tolstoy, who in his famous letter to the Tsar had raised his voice against the terrible slaughter of workers. Now also such a voice was needed, and Gorky was considered the right man to call on the present Tsars to bethink themselves. But most of those present at the gathering scouted the idea. Gorky was of the Bolsheviki, they said. He would not do anything. On several previous occasions he had been appealed to, but refused to intercede. The conference brought no results. Still, there were some persons in Petrograd who could not remain silent. They sent the following letter to the Soviet of Defense. To the Petrograd Soviet of Labor and Defense, Chairman Zinoviev. To remain silent now is impossible, even criminal. Recent events impel us anarchists to speak out and to declare our attitude in the present situation. The spirit of ferment and dissatisfaction manifest among the workers and sailors is the result of causes that demand our serious attention. Cold and hunger have produced dissatisfaction, and the absence of any opportunity for discussion and criticism is forcing the workers and sailors to air their grievances in the open. White Guardist bands wish and may try to exploit this dissatisfaction in their own class interests. Hiding behind the workers and sailors, they throw out slogans of the Constituent Assembly, of free trade, and similar demands. We anarchists have long since exposed the fiction of these slogans, and we declare to the whole world that we will fight with arms against any counter-revolutionary attempt in cooperation with all friends of the social revolution, and hand in hand with the Bolsheviki. Concerning the conflict between the Soviet government and the workers and sailors, we hold that it must be settled not by force of arms, but by means of comradely, fraternal, revolutionary agreement. Resort to bloodshed on the part of the Soviet government will not, in the given situation, intimidate or quiet the workers. On the contrary, it will serve only to aggravate matters and will strengthen the hands of the Entente and of internal counter-revolution. More important still, the use of force by the workers and peasants, government against workers and sailors, will have a reactionary effect upon the international revolutionary movement and will everywhere result in incalculable harm to the social revolution. Comrades Bolsheviki, bethink yourselves before it is too late. Do not play with fire. You are about to make a most serious and decisive step. We hereby submit to you the following proposition. Let a commission be selected to consist of 5 persons, inclusive of 2 anarchists. The commission is to go to Kronstadt to settle the dispute by peaceful means. In the given situation, this is the most radical method. It will be of international revolutionary significance. Petrograd, Alexander Berkman, March 5, 1921, Emma Goldman, Perkus, Petrovsky. But this protest was ignored. On March 7th, Trotsky began the bombardment of Kronstadt, and on the 17th the fortress and city were taken, after numerous assaults involving terrific human sacrifice. Thus Kronstadt was liquidated, and the counter-revolutionary plot quenched in blood. The conquest of the city was characterized by ruthless savagery, although not a single one of the communists arrested by the Kronstadt sailors had been injured or killed by them. Even before the storming of the fortress, the Bolsheviki summarily executed numerous soldiers of the Red Army whose revolutionary spirit and solidarity caused them to refuse to participate in the bloodbath. Several days after the glorious victory over Kronstadt, Lenin said at the 10th Congress of the Communist Party of Russia, "The sailors did not want the counter-revolutionists, but they did not want us either." And irony of Bolshevism. At that very Congress, Lenin advocated free trade, a more reactionary step than any charged to the Kronstadt sailors. Between the 1st and the 17th of March, several regiments of the Petrograd garrison and all the sailors of the port were disarmed and ordered to the Ukraina and the Caucasus. The Bolsheviki feared to trust them in the Kronstadt situation. At the first psychological moment, they might make common cause with Kronstadt. In fact, many Red soldiers of the Krasnaya Gorka and the surrounding garrisons were also in sympathy with Kronstadt and were forced at the point of guns to attack the sailors. On March 17th, the communist government completed its victory over the Kronstadt proletariat, and on the 18th of March, it commemorated the martyrs of the Paris Commune. It was apparent to all who were mute witnesses to the outrage committed by the Bolsheviki that the crime against Kronstadt was far more enormous than the slaughter of the communards in 1871, for it was done in the name of the social revolution, in the name of the Socialist Republic. History will not be deceived. In the annals of the Russian Revolution, the names of Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Dybenko will be added to those of Thiers and Galifet. 17 dreadful days, more dreadful than anything I had known in Russia. Agonizing days because of my utter helplessness in the face of the terrible things enacted before my eyes. It was just at that time that I happened to visit a friend who had been a patient in a hospital for months. I found him much distressed. Many of those wounded in the attack on Kronstadt had been brought to the same hospital, mostly Kursanti. I had opportunity to speak to one of them. His physical suffering, he said, was nothing as compared with his mental agony. Too late he had realized that he had been duped by the cry of counter-revolution. There were no Tsarist generals in Kronstadt, no white guardists. He found only his own comrades, sailors and soldiers who had heroically fought for the revolution. The rations of the ordinary patients in the hospitals were far from satisfactory, but the wounded Kursanti received the best of everything, and a select committee of communist members was assigned to look after their comfort. Some of the Kursanti, among them the man I had spoken to, refused to accept the special privileges. "They want to pay us for murder," they said. Fearing that the whole institution would be influenced by these awakened victims, the management ordered them removed to a separate ward, the communist ward, as the patients called it. Kronstadt broke the last thread that held me to the Bolsheviki. The wanton slaughter they had instigated spoke more eloquently against them than aught else. Whatever their pretenses in the past, the Bolsheviki now proved themselves the most pernicious enemies of the revolution. I could have nothing further to do with them.
This concludes today's reading of My Disillusionment in Russia, by Emma Goldman. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.